The Crown Prosecution Service has launched a public consultation on proposed new guidance regarding the treatment of deception as to sex in rape and serious sexual assault cases. Critics say the proposed guidance illustrates the impact of the government allowing gender identity ideology to embed itself across our public institutions. To discuss this, I'm joined by the former criminal barrister Dennis Kavanagh. Welcome to the show, Dennis. This is quite a complex subject, so perhaps you could talk us through what exactly is the Crown Prosecution Service proposing here? Well,
I suppose the sensible place to start is the background to this, which was in 2015-ish. Stonewall and Co were campaigning to, in effect, water down sex by deception prosecutions as they signed up to the extreme trans lobby, and it's led to the consultation we have before us. And I can tell you that it's the first rape policy I've ever read that finds reasons not to prosecute defendants. It is a curious document that says this. It says if you've got a situation where someone is deceived as to the biological sex of someone they're having sex with, the first question it asks Crown prosecutors to ask is not, were they deceived? Was it a bad deception? Instead, it says, no, we must take an offender-centric view and ask whether they were living as their new gender identity.
But that's quite a shocking development, isn't it? Because it's excuse-making for a form of sexual assault.
It gets worse. Not only do we have the first question, which is staff in the Crown Prosecution Service sort of marking people out of 10 for their gender identity. When you get to question 2, which is, yes, there has been a deception, prosecutors must ask themselves, has the victim, quote, willfully closed their eyes to the obvious? Now, that is gender identity's version of was she wearing a short skirt.
Yes.
That is an extraordinary...
It's victim-blaming.
It's absolutely victim-blaming.
So I suppose their counter-argument in this would be, well, you know, if someone identifies as the opposite sex and therefore believes themselves to be the opposite sex, which gender ideologues do, and then they participate in a sexual act but they don't inform the other person, because from their perspective, they are that, authentically that sex, even though it involves this denial of reality. Then they would say that that's therefore not sexual assault. There hasn't been deception, they would say.
Well, what have we got there in criminal law? The belief of the defendant, which is not based in material reality, trumps the deception of the victim. That is gender identity, ideology, corruption of a public institution. Because what is important, and this is crazy when you consider this service has got to look at evidence in serious criminal matters, what is paramount, it would seem, is the belief of the defendant. And I've got to ask myself this, and I'm sure many people will, who on earth is speaking up for the victim here? Because the balance of criminal justice depends, does it not, on one side the defence speaking up for the accused, and one side the Crown speaking up for the victim. I don't see anything here speaking up for the victim. It's entirely focused on the defendant's gender identity, whatever that may be. And this consultation tells us that gender identity could be things like gender queer, non-binary, gender fluid. There's all this language now. And I say in passing, it's bad news for any employee of the Crown Prosecution Service who's gender critical, because they cannot operate this draft policy. Because question 1 says, look at the gender identity and tell us if that gender identity is convincing or not vis-à-vis the deception. This is institutional capture. And we've seen this again and again and again with gender ideologues. We have the phrases assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth, classic gender identity lingua franca all over this consultation. And this is in a week, of course, where we've seen the effects of institutional corruption. We've seen what's happened in the safeguarding scandal, allegedly, at Mermaids. It's off the back of the Tavistock being closed down because it is not safe, in the words of Hilary Cass. That's what happens when this extremist ideology corrupts public institutions. And here it is in the Crown Prosecution Service itself.
But why is it the case that it is there? I mean, why is it the case that let's face it, a belief system which is not rooted in reality is now trumping reality? I mean, we have this situation now where ideologues and activists, they want to reorganise society around the idea that gender supersedes sex. So it's not just the case that they want to take into account people's gender identity within these frameworks, but actually that it should replace the notion of biological sex when it comes to formation of policy.
Well, there's no public mandate for this. There's no constituency that supports this. No one put this to the public in a general election. And again and again and again, we see a certain class of people, principally located in the charity sector, and their colleagues, again and again and again, corrupting the language of public institutions. And this has happened in the criminal justice context at the beginning of the criminal justice system, at the initiation of the prosecution. These arguments would not fly in the Court of Appeal Criminal Division, which in the Crown against McNally, a 2013 case, which deals with this matter, made very clear that sex by deception can vitiate, in the words of the criminal law, that's cancel out consent. Here we are again. This is classic. You've used, may or may not know about the Denton strategy, which no doubt you've heard of, which is a strategy popularised by gender ideologues who say, look, don't discuss this in public. Don't put it to votes. Tack it onto more popular causes, as in Ireland, gay marriage, gender self-ID was tacked onto that. Always operate in the shadows. Here we are again, and in the most serious area of criminal justice policy I can think of.
But if it is established in law that sex by deception, you are taking away the consent of that person, if that's already established, how can this then be turned over just on the basis of this faith?
Well, quite, I suppose. If you can't win up in the Court of Appeal as a gender ideologue, what you do is you win back in the CPS, so that the prosecution's never bought in the first place.
But who's allowing that to happen? What I'm saying is, who is the CPS accountable to? Why is it that someone in the government, for instance, isn't making clear that the Equality Act is very clear about sex, for instance, although it is continually misinterpreted as gender identity when that's not what it means? Why are local authorities able to twist these things? Why is the CPS, why are the police, why is the judiciary able to twist this stuff?
Don't we ask this question again and again and again? Don't we ask this question about why the police are getting the protected characteristics wrong, or why the NHS won't say the word woman? You know, here we are again with the CPS, another corrupted public institution, speaking the language of extreme gender ideology. Obviously, CPS, to answer your question, is accountable to various secretaries of state, both Justice and the Home Secretary. And you would hope that they'd have a look at this and a conversation about what's going on, because I do want to go back to the beginning here. These cases of sex by deception very often feature teenagers. They feature sexually inexperienced, very young people who are very vulnerable, who are often not very worldly wise, who are often manipulated. That's who we're talking about here. We're talking about failing them as a constituency.
Yes.
And you know, what are we going to sacrifice on the altar of the gender gods next? Because we're not going to take rape prosecution policy seriously. We're going to end up in a situation where we've got special treatment for one class of defendants and we've got second-class victims.
Is it just the case that those people that you mentioned in government don't understand the issues, and all they think that this is standing up for an oppressed minority in the way that people used to stand up for gay people back in the 70s and 80s against all odds? Is that what's going on here?
That may well be the case. I've no doubt as well that the government are juggling so many different things that it's always difficult to keep on top of this stuff. But I would just say this on the gay comparison. This has the capacity to hit gay people pretty hard.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, say, of gay males' sexual spaces, like, I don't know, saunas, dark rooms, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
This is an accident and a tragedy waiting to happen, this sort of stuff.
Yes.
Because these sorts of deceptions do matter and they will cause serious harm.
So then how do we push back against it? If it is the case that this has now infected all of our major institutions, you mentioned the NHS as well. Yep. You've got the Annex B policy that the NHS has where the NHS is meant to accommodate people by sex. You know, wards for women, wards for men. But the NHS official policy is actually if someone identifies out of that biological sex class into another, then you accommodate them that way. And then if someone on the ward complains, if a woman says, I don't want to be on the ward with a man, someone with male genitalia, they have to say to that person, that's not a man, you're not right about that. Yeah. That's official policy in the NHS. Gaslighting as official policy. Yeah. So what do we do at that point? That hasn't come from a top-down thing. That hasn't come from the government. Right. So how can the government weed it out if they didn't initiate it?
Well, I think it's incumbent on all of us to call it out, fight it, and to be active citizens. So the consultation I'm talking about is a public consultation. It's going to close, I think, in mid-December. It's available on the Crown Prosecution Service website. People should respond to that. We do have to make our voices heard on this, and we do need to bring this to the attention of politicians.
Yeah. I mean, because we're talking about potentially rape victims here. It's a very, very serious question.
Absolutely.
And what can people do to sort of to push back against it themselves? Is it just a question of contacting politicians, informing them, or is it more about informing ourselves? Because I think a lot of people fall for this trick where activists say, if you raise these issues, if you say that I can't identify the way I want to identify, then you are a transphobe, you are hateful, you are a bigot, even fascist. You know, all of these slurs that are thrown about people who have genuine, legitimate concerns.
We have to stop being scared to raise genuine, legitimate concerns, particularly in such serious fields. I mean, we're at a stage, and I'm sure you've heard this on Twitter, where people are saying if you say you are same-sex attracted, that is hateful and transphobic. The four walls...
So to be gay is to be transphobic?
I've heard that. You know, I've heard same-sex attraction is a transphobic dog whistle. Now, look, if you're going to let the four walls of public debate and fear of being called hateful box you in to the point that you can't say anything, then what's the point, frankly? We have to address this. We have to stand up to this. We can't have public institutions spewing out policies that are damaging, that are based in unscientific language, and that ultimately there's no constituency for, and ultimately have the effect of subverting the rule of law.